Okay, this is part 2 of the video Abraham and Isaac and the sacrifice that God asked Abraham to make. You have to see part 1 first, and the way that you can do that if you don't know how to get to part 1 is to look at my other videos. And if you look directly above my head on the YouTube interface, not on the video itself, but on the YouTube page, look above my head and you'll see a little box that says videos. It'll have a number in front of it, and that's the number of videos that I have. Click on that box and it'll give you a list of all the videos that I have, and go to Abraham and Isaac part 1. Watch that first and then come back to this. Okay, having said that, let me continue here along with what I was saying. Let's see, what was I saying? Let's figure this out. This is how God must have felt when Jesus asked him, just before Jesus was about to be crucified in the Garden of Gethsemane. He prayed to God and he said, "Let this cup pass before me, but not my will, but yours be done." Jesus, his whole life, knew he was, not his whole life, I don't know, but most of his life at least, we know that he knew he was going to be crucified and die for the sins of the world. For one reason, it was predicted in the Old Testament many times and in many places, and he knew the Old Testament well. For two reasons, he had constant contact with God, his Father, who would have told him, and for three, he was God himself. So he did know, and he did come here in obedience to the Father, and he was willing to do this. But for a period of time, when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and it was getting down to the pedal to the metal, or whatever you want to call it, his humanity kicked in, and he asked God to let this cup pass before me. In other words, let this thing not happen. Let's do it some other way. I can't endure this. But let your will, not mine, be done. And this is how God must have felt, I think, when Jesus said this to him. That God probably felt the same way as when Isaac said to Abraham, "You know, we're up on the mountain here, but where's the lamb for the sacrifice?" I think God and Abraham went through more pain and suffering in seeing the sacrifice of God's Son, Jesus, and the upcoming but not completed sacrifice of Isaac with Abraham. The fathers, I think, went through more pain than the sons. But anyway, let me continue. Here, in John 5:19, Jesus gives this very telling statement. He says, "I tell you the truth, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees the Father doing. Because whatever the Father does, the Son does also." You see, Jesus was not some puppet of God, some robot, some mechanic. After all, he was God, and he had his own will. But his role as the second member of the Trinity, the Son, was to serve the Father, and to do that was part of his role, was to serve the Father and do as the Father says. As for Abraham, he is sure that what God commands is good, that what God promises cannot be broken. And remember, God promised to make him a great nation. Now, I can't state this emphatically enough. In matters of God, whoever consults his flesh and blood, whoever listens to himself instead of God, will never be able to offer up his Isaac, so to speak, as Abraham did. You will never be able to have the kind of faith that Abraham had if you consult your own understanding over God's understanding. Let me go on to verse 9. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Now, at this point, Isaac was 22 years old, and Abraham was an old man. Remember, he was born to Abraham in his old age. He was over 100, I think. Abraham at this point was probably about 120. So Isaac, at the age of 22, could have easily overcome him and not allowed this to happen, what he realized was about to happen. But there must have been some great faith or obedience on the part of Abraham, on the part of Isaac, either to his father or to God, to allow this to happen. So both of them were pretty good men. Verse 10. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Now get this. Here I am, he replied. Abraham, after going through all of this, after thinking he had to sacrifice his own son by the hand of God, when God calls him, his first reply, here I am. He's ready to do whatever God asks him, even after he saw what God was capable of asking of him, to sacrifice his own son. That is faith, that is trust in the goodness of God and the promises of God, etc., etc. Here I am, ever ready to obey God, even though he probably understood very little of what or why he was going through and the horror that he was going to have to endure, or that he was enduring. He still trusted God. Then verse 12, the angel says, do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Here we know that Jesus is speaking, not an angel, because he says, I know you fear God. Then he says, you have not withheld from me your only son. First he refers to the Father, then to himself. Verse 13, Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. The ram, first Isaac was the metaphor for Christ, or the type of Christ as it's called. Then the ram becomes the metaphor for Christ. And when it says that he was caught in the thicket, the ancient biblical word for thicket can also mean a lattice or crowning on top of a pole. Alright, so we further see the ram as a type of Christ because it has the crown of thorns on it. And then Abraham, he went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his own son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. You see, in those days, they sometimes named places after a characteristic of God. And here, God, by giving the ram to Abraham, provided a way out of him having to sacrifice his son. Finally, the story ends with Jesus speaking to Abraham again, saying, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sands on the seashores. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me.